Okay, let's dive into this. Imagine trying to picture, well, the very first sparks of complex life on Earth, right? Creatures from 500 million years ago.
It's pretty mind-bending just thinking about that time frame.
Totally. And then imagine finding this one tiny fossil from back then, something scientists looked at and were like, certain they knew its identity.
Yeah, they felt they can place it quite neatly.
Placed it right at the root of a major group of animals, ones we still see everywhere today.
Snails, clams, that sort of thing, mollusks.
Exactly. And then years down the line, new evidence pops up and just completely proves them wrong.
Turns out, not an early ancestor of snails at all.
Not even close. Its true identity is something, well, much stranger, actually. Part of this long-vanished group, and this whole mix-up, this reclassification, it forces us to rethink some fundamental ideas about that whole explosion of life back then.
That's exactly the story we're digging into today. We're drawing on some really fascinating new research. It was just published in Science. Yeah, by an international team, folks from Durham University, Yunnan University involved. It's a perfect example of how challenging and honestly how exciting understanding the deep past can be.
Absolutely. So our mission, really, in this deep dive is to follow the clues, the scientific detective work that uncovered what this ancient creature really was. We want to understand why scientists were fooled for so long, and maybe more importantly, why shuffling this one fossil around isn't just a minor correction.
Right, why it actually shakes up our picture of life 500 million years ago.
Exactly. Think of this as your shortcut to understanding this incredible bit of paleontology. Turns out this fossil was a real master of disguise.
A master of disguise is a great way to put it. The creature we're talking about is called Shishania aculeata.
Shishania aculeata, okay. And where did this little trickster come from?
It was found in these remarkably well-preserved deposits in Yunnan Province, southern China. They're about 500 million years old, right from the Cambrian period.
Ah, Yunnan. That area is famous for incredible fossils, isn't it? Like, amazing preservation.
World famous, yeah. They give us these exquisite snapshots of the Cambrian Explosion, that time when animal life just diversified incredibly rapidly.
And for a good while, based on the fossils they had, the consensus view was that Shishania fit into a very specific slot on that early animal family tree.
That's right. For quite some time, the thinking was Shishania was a very, very primitive mollusk.
Okay.
The interpretation was basically that it represented an early, simple form in the lineage that eventually led to all modern mollusks. Snails, slugs, clams, oysters, even octopuses.
Wow, okay. So what was it about the fossil that made it scream early mollusk to researchers back then?
Well, the initial interpretations really zeroed in on a couple of key features they thought they saw.
Like what?
They believed they could see evidence of something that looked like a muscular foot.
Ah, like a snail uses to move.
Exactly, that kind of structure, which is pretty defining for many mollusks. And they also noted these mineralized bits, interpreted as defensive spines.
Spines, okay.
And while spines aren't only found in mollusks, the whole package seemed to fit some ideas about what those very early mollusk ancestors might have looked like. It seemed plausible.
Right, okay, so it had these features that, on the surface at least, seemed to tick the mollusk box. But then something changed. A new study came along, different approach.
Exactly. This new international study went back to Shishania, but they had a huge advantage this time.
Which was?
Access to newer specimens, even better preserved than the earlier ones. And crucially, they could use more advanced imaging techniques, stuff that lets you see the fossil structure in way more detail.
Okay, high-tech look.
Yep. And what they found just completely overturned that whole mollusk idea.
So, wait. It's not an early mollusk after all that?
Emphatically not an early mollusk. Nope. The new analysis revealed Shishania actually belongs to a completely different and frankly much weirder group of ancient creatures.
Weirder? Okay, I'm intrigued. What group?
They're called chancelloriids.
Chancelloriids. Okay, definitely haven't seen one of those at the beach recently. What were they like?
No, definitely not. Think of them as, well, essentially ancient bag-like sea creatures.
Bag-like?
Yeah, they were sessile, meaning they were anchored to the seafloor. They didn't move around like a snail.
Okay, stuck in place.
Right. And their most obvious feature was their whole body surface was covered in these elaborate, usually star-shaped defensive spines or spicules.
Whoa, spiny bags.
Pretty much. And they're a group that's unique to the Cambrian period. They show up, seem to do quite well for a while, and then poof, They disappear completely around 490 million years ago.
So a relatively short-lived experiment in evolution compared to the mollusks. And you said they look a bit like sponges, but aren't.
Right. Superficially, maybe the anchored, simple body shape might make you think sponge. But their spicules, those star-shaped spines, they have a much more complex internal microstructure than anything you see in sponges.
Ah, okay.
That intricate detail always hinted they were probably something more complex than sponges, maybe related to other more advanced animal groups, though their exact position was always a bit murky.
Okay, so if Shishania is actually one of these spiny stationary bags, how on earth did scientists mistake it for a potentially mobile, soft-bodied mollusk ancestor for so long? That seems like a big leap.
It does. And this is where the detective story gets really cool.
Yeah.
The new study figured out that many of the features that look so convincingly mollusk-like, they weren't real biological structures.
Not real. What were they then?
They were artifacts, things created during the fossilization process itself.
Artifacts, like misleading clues left behind by time and pressure squeezing the rock.
Precisely. Take that muscular foot they thought they saw.
Yeah.
Turns out it wasn't anatomy at all. It was purely a result of the fossil specimen being squashed and distorted as it turned into rock over millions of years.
No way.
Yeah. The researchers called it a taphonomic illusion. Taphonomy is the study of how things decay and fossilize.
Right, right.
And these illusions just show how incredibly tricky that whole process can make interpreting fossils.
A taphonomic illusion. So the rock itself was basically playing tricks on the scientists' eyes.
It absolutely was. And it wasn't just the foot. Other things, too, like what they thought was a specific paintbrush-like pattern in the spines, also shown to be just random artifacts of preservation, not biology.
Right.
Essentially, the compression and deformation took what was probably a fairly simple, maybe cylindrical or bag-like animal, and flattened and folded it in ways that looked like it had more complex internal structures or external shapes than it really did.
So it wasn't the creature itself that had that complexity. It was like fossil origami created by geology flattening it.
Fossil origami.
Yeah.
That's exactly the term the researchers use, and it's perfect. Dr. Martin Smith, one of the authors, he really captured this. He described these ancient fossils, saying they turned out to be masters of disguise. He even admitted he was initially thrilled when Shishania seemed to fit his own ideas about early mollusks.
Wow.
Yeah, he said it seemed to match the early slug-like animals I'd always imagined. So even a top expert was initially convinced.
So that makes the turnaround even more striking.
Absolutely. He explained that as they found more specimens showing this same preservation pattern and started to recognize this fossil origami effect, well, it forced him to reevaluate everything.
Must have been a big moment.
Huge. He said the real identity started to unfurl once they found other known chancelloriids preserved in a similar way in the same rocks. That helped them decode the preservation style for that group.
That's just incredible, that scientific process of realization, seeing through the disguise. Okay, so let's get right to it. Why does this matter so much? Why is correctly identifying Shishania as a chancelloriid relative, not an early mollusk, such a big deal? What's the significance?
Well, it's definitely not just about changing a label in a museum drawer. This discovery sends ripples through our understanding of early life in a few key ways.
Okay, like what?
First, for the mollusks themselves. If Shishania isn't one of their early ancestors, well, that particular piece of evidence about what the earliest mollusks look like, it's gone.
Ah, so it leaves a gap in the mollusk origin story that needs filling.
Exactly. We have to look elsewhere for those specific clues now. But then there are the chancelloriids.
Right, the spiny bags. What does Shishania tell us about them?
For them, Shishania is actually quite interesting because it seems to represent a simpler form within their group. Its spines are relatively simple compared to the complex, star-shaped ones seen in many other chancelloriids.
Okay.
So finding Shishania suggests that those really ornate spicules probably didn't evolve by, say, modifying some pre-existing skeleton they inherited from an even earlier ancestor.
Right.
Instead, it looks more like chancelloriids developed those complex spicules de novo.
De novo, you mean like from scratch, invented them?
Essentially, yes. They seemingly invented that complex skeletal feature entirely within their own lineage, rather than building on something older.
Wow, inventing complexity from scratch within a group that ultimately didn't make it long term. That's a really cool insight into how evolution can innovate.
It really is. And that connects directly to the biggest questions about the Cambrian Explosion itself. How did all these radically different, complex body plans pop up so relatively quickly in geological time?
Yeah, the big mystery.
Well, seeing examples like Shishania jump from one presumed family tree to a totally different one, and seeing how key features like complex spines might have evolved de novo, it gives us fresh insight into the actual mechanisms of evolutionary novelty during that incredibly creative period.
So it's not just about shuffling fossils around. It helps us understand the process of how complex life arose in the first place.
Precisely. It helps clarify the picture of where chancelloriids fit. Adding this simpler member strengthens their branch on the tree of life. And, beyond the specifics of mollusks or chancelloriids, this whole story serves as a really powerful cautionary tale in paleontology.
So.
It hammers home that you always have to be careful about over-interpreting features in fossils, especially when they're compressed or distorted like this. You can be easily fooled.
Right, the taphonomic illusion.
Exactly. It really underscores the difficulty of the job and why things like high-resolution imaging and finding multiple, well-preserved specimens are just so critical to avoid falling for that fossil origami.
It just highlights how incredibly hard it is to read a story that's been locked in rock for 500 million years.
Absolutely. And one last point, it really highlights the incredible value of these exceptionally preserved fossil sites like the ones in Yunnan, China, and also the importance of international collaboration. Discoveries like this, ones that genuinely shift our understanding, often depend on getting access to unique fossil material and bringing together scientists with different kinds of expertise.
So let's recap. We have this tiny spiny creature, Shishania, from 500 million years ago. First, it's confidently placed on the mollusk family tree, maybe near the base, partly because fossilization squashed it in a way that looked like it had a foot.
Right, the disguise.
Then better fossils and better tech reveal the disguise. It's actually a relative of the chancelloriids, these extinct, anchored, spiny bag creatures.
A completely different branch of life.
And that's not just a minor taxonomic shuffle. It erases a potential clue about early mollusks, tells us chancelloriids likely invented their fancy spines from scratch, and gives us insights into how evolutionary novelty happened during the Cambrian Explosion, all while reminding us just how deceptive the fossil record can be.
That sums it up perfectly. It's a fantastic illustration that the history of life isn't some neat, straight line we've already figured out. Our understanding is constantly being refined, sometimes dramatically, by new evidence and new ways of looking at old clues.
It really makes you appreciate how much interpreting ancient life relies on reading these incredibly old, sometimes really misleading signals from the past.
It certainly does.
So here's something to maybe mull over. If something that seemed as, relatively clear-cut as an early mollusk ancestor can turn out to be a completely different creature from a long-extinct line, all because of the tricks of fossilization, how many other masters of disguise might still be hiding out there in the fossil record? What other fundamental pieces of our understanding of life's history are just waiting for a new fossil or a new technology or maybe just a fresh perspective to reveal their true shape and completely reshape what we think we know?